As always, it's a privilege to be able to stand in front of you and to share with you a portion of God's Word. It's a privilege that we are all part of a group here where there is confidence in the men that can stand up and fill in Donnie's absence, and I know especially I am thankful to the elders for the opportunity and the confidence that they show in each and every one of us that do this. I know I speak for myself and for all the other men that means a lot to us. This morning I want us to consider a human emotion. And a human emotion that is, of course, God-given. It's an emotion that dictates how we interact with the world around us. It's an emotion that safeguards us, protects us. It's an emotion that, when handled properly, pushes us towards serving God. This emotion, actually, I've had an encounter that pretty much everyone in the building witnessed. I had an encounter with this emotion just a few weeks ago. As I'm sure many of you remember, Owen got a little ahead of himself and took a tumble and caught his head on the corner of the pew, and before I knew it, there was blood everywhere. And this emotion allowed me to act when I didn't know how to act, and to get him out of here, and to take care of him, and to help stop the bleeding, and be prepared to do whatever I needed to do. And that emotion I want us to consider is an emotion that each and every one of us should have. Something that each and every one of us should have dwelling within us at each and every moment of the day. I want us to discuss this morning the Christian and fear. I want us to talk about fear. See, it's my understanding, my belief that while we often discuss fear in a biblical context, I don't know that we always give it the proper due. I don't know that we always consider what exactly fear is and how it serves us, and how fear can help us serve our God. We're going to start this morning with just these four very simple points. I don't intend this to be a very exhaustive, in-depth study, because this is a very simplistic topic. Fear is something that we all experience, but I want us to talk about what fear is. I want us to talk about biblical fear. What does the Bible have to say about fear? We're then going to turn around and look at three biblical examples of fear. We're going to look at three specific instances in a total of 5 different men who experienced grave and serious fear. And we're going to see some lessons that we can learn both from those examples as well as from the points before it. So let us begin by discussing what is fear. Now, we know what fear is. Every single one of us has felt fear at some point. Some of us maybe more than others. We comprehend what fear is, but for the sake of being thorough, let's define fear. Fear, as we can see on the screen, is a basic, intense emotion aroused by the detection of imminent threat, involving an immediate alarm reaction that mobilizes the organism, that would be us, by triggering a set of physiological responses. Fear changes how your body operates, is what that says in layman's terms. These include a rapid heartbeat, redirection of blood flow away from the periphery toward the gut, basically away from everything else and towards the internal parts of your body to keep you safe. It's a tensing of the muscles and a general mobilization of the organism, that being us, to take action. Now, there's a lot in that we could sit here and unpack. We're not going to do that. There's a couple things, though, that I want us to understand about fear. First of all, fear is a basic emotion. What that means is it is something unescapable. It is as much a part of us as any other feeling or emotion that we experience. Secondly, fear is a response to something that threatens us. Now, we could talk about all the physical things that may threaten us, right? Things that we are fearful of in a physical sense. But fear goes beyond the physical. Fear goes into our minds, into our hearts. A threat against our mind can result in fear. Think of a nightmare, right? A nightmare often results in fear. There's nothing physical about a nightmare whatsoever. The other thing I want you to notice is that fear causes a general mobilization of the organism to take action. What that means is fear causes us to do something. If you are scared and fear causes no reaction for you whatsoever, something wrong. There's something wrong there. Now, we'll talk a little bit about what some of those actions are. There are three that psychologists, and this does come from the APA, that's the American Psychology Association, but there are three major responses, right? We know two of them very well. There's fight or flight. You're going to fight, or you're going to run away. But the third one that we don't talk about is to freeze. The three F's, fight, flight, or freeze. That's a mouthful. But all three of these are actions. Inaction in and of itself is an action. And all three of these responses to fear are what we experience on a day-to-day basis. But there's some things I want us to gather from this definition. First of all, fear is natural. We've well established this. Fear is natural. Any man, and I say man because it does tend to be men, who says they're not scared is a liar. Fear is natural. And if it is natural, that means fear is created by God. If it exists in us from birth, that means it is created by God. And what that definition also tells us is that fear protects us. Fear is what causes us to seek some form of safety when we are threatened. And so, therefore, fear is a very important thing for us to understand. Something else that we need to understand is that fear is innate. It's a very fancy way of saying that fear is inborn. We are born with a sense of fear. Now, there's some debate to what degree people are born with a sense of fear. But it's fairly well established that through study of infants, that there is a natural disposition to be scared of water. I've seen this with my own kids. They were terrified of baths when they started to be old enough to notice what was going on around them. They were terrified of water. Okay? There's an intense fear of heights. Some of us probably in this audience still struggle with that. That, as best as psychologists can tell, is from birth. One of the biggest fears is the fear of isolation, being alone. Many, in fact, I would say most people, are terrified of being alone. Truly alone. These fears are innate. They're born within us. They affect us with little or no outside influence. To be honest, these are not the fears I'm concerned with this morning. The fears that we are born with are not necessarily what I'm concerned with. What I am concerned with is that fear is learned. We can learn to fear. And you've experienced this, whether you realize it or not, but here's a very simple example. You might learn to be scared of sharp objects. I've known of people who are terrified. If there is a knife out, if there is anything sharp, they want to stay as far away from it as possible. Chances are they've learned that behavior. Maybe they had injured themselves severely at a younger age through some past injury. Fear can be learned. The fear of public speaking, I'm convinced, is a learned behavior. We see the attitudes towards it of those around us, and we therefore mimic that attitude. Fear can be learned. You can also learn to overcome some fear, right? If that person that's scared of knives goes to work at a restaurant, they're going to be exposed to it day in and day out. And that exposure over time breeds comfort, or at least breeds a lack of fear. Okay, so fear can be learned. Fear can be unlearned. There's a logical conclusion there that if our fears can be both learned and unlearned, then we have control over our fears. We exhibit some form of control over our fear. Now, what we've got so far is nothing that you don't already know. We have established nothing new. These are all things that are part of the human experience. Even if you've never thought about it this way before, you are aware of these facts. We understand that fear is natural. We understand that fear is God-given. We understand that some fears are born within us and other fears are learned. So now let's talk about, and we're going to spend a good bit of time here talking about biblical fear. What does the Bible have to say about fear? We're going to divide this into two sections. We're going to talk about what we should fear. What has God told us we should fear? And hopefully we all know what the conclusion of that will be. But what has God told us to be afraid of? And then we're going to talk about what we are not to be afraid of. Because the Bible is specific about both. First of all, when we determine what we should fear, or better, I should say, who we should fear, the only conclusion is this: God. According to the text, the only being that we should fear is God Himself. We're not going to go through every single one of these passages, but I do ask that you bear with me. We're going to go through most of them. I want us to determine, or to establish definitively, what the Bible has to say about fearing God. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, this very famous section of Scripture, Deuteronomy chapter 6 starts a section of Scripture that Jews were so familiar with. This was their bread and butter, if you will. They often would bind this part of the law to themselves, right? We often refer to this as the Shema. But in chapter 6, verse 13, the commandment that Moses gives is, "You shall fear only the Lord your God. You shall worship Him and swear only by His name." Now, I want us to make a quick note. Your translation, or maybe your footnote, might not use the word fear. It might say reverence. Reverence, to hold in high regard. To hold is that which is higher than yourself. To hold in awe. Reverence. See, here's where English does us a bit of a disservice. When we talk about fear, we think of it very one-dimensionally, of being scared of something. But fear is actually far more than that. Fear involves reverence. It involves awe. And we see that here in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 13. The word that's used, fear, also can be translated as reverence. Both meanings are meant in this text here. In Joshua chapter 24, a very, very similar circumstance. Joshua chapter 24. This is where Joshua is challenging the children of Israel, saying, "Here is what I propose to you. This is my challenge to you, that you need to choose for yourself who you're going to serve." Verse 14, Joshua says, "Now therefore fear," again, your footnote might say reverence, "the Lord, and serve Him in sincerity and truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord." Both Moses and Joshua have instructed the children of Israel, fear God. Psalm chapter 2. I guess I should say Psalm 2. Psalm 2. Again, just compounding some evidence here. Psalm 2 and verse 11. This time, at least in the New American Standard, which I read from, fear is not used, but it's the other word. Psalm 2 and verse 11, "Worship the Lord with reverence," with fear. Worship the Lord with fear. And here's an interesting little bit that follows it, "and rejoice with trembling." I think we underemphasize the word trembling in texts such as this. We even sing a song about how God causes us to tremble, and we repeat that several times. But I wonder, do we tremble before God? See, the word tremble there is exactly what it sounds like. It's to shake, as if you are scared, as if you are full of fear, of reverence, of awe. We'll skip the Proverbs passage. You know Ecclesiastes 12 and 13 well. "Fear God, and do His commandments, keep His commandments, for this is man's all." We're going to come back to Hebrews 10:31. We're not going to go there at this point, although you might know it well. The last one of these I want us to look at is 1 Peter chapter 2. This is one that stands out to me for a number of reasons. But I find the language that Peter uses is interesting. In 1 Peter chapter 2, in his direction there, Peter says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. Why I find that interesting is what Peter has actually done. If you read carefully, Peter has actually included all of mankind and God in the same sentence. But there's only one that Peter uses the word fear. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. See, when we talk about the fear of God, we should consider it in terms of what the word fear means in our English language. It, of course, means that we should be terrified. And I use that word intentionally, and we'll come back to it. We should be terrified, in a sense, of our God. That is a biblical concept. But at the same time, it should not be fear strictly for the sake of fear. It should be honor, reverence, humility, because He is the Creator. He is the one who has made us all. We are made in His image. We are, in all senses of the word, inferior to Him. He is greater than us. We are lower than Him. And therefore, we should fear Him, hold Him in reverence. Let's talk about three things that we should not fear, that the Bible explicitly says, do not fear these. So what should we not fear? The first one, and maybe the one that is most obvious to you, is man. We should not fear man. Psalm 118, we just studied this a short while ago on Wednesday evenings. Psalm 118, and this is quoted in the book of Hebrews. Psalm 118, and in verse 6, the psalmist there says, this is a very often quoted verse here, but the psalmist says, "The Lord is for me, I will not fear. What can man do to me?" The Hebrew author quotes this and applies it to being content before God. If you are content before God, there is nothing really that man can do to take that away from you. There is no reason, there is no cause to fear man when we are standing as we should before God. He should be the subject of our fear. Our fellow man should absolutely not be. 1 Peter chapter 3. Again, I know we're kind of hopping from verse to verse, and I appreciate it that you're following along, but 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 13 through 15, Peter here is talking about the duties that we have when we are persecuted, when by earthly standards we should have every reason to be terrified for our lives. Here's what Peter has to say. "Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed." And here he quotes Isaiah 8. He says, "And do not fear their intimidation. Do not be troubled." So when we talk about the human concept of fear, what the world around us, and sometimes we ourselves think of, is anything that causes me harm, I should be terrified of. Because that's what the human emotion fear is for, right? If that snake is going to kill me, I'm terrified of that snake because it will cause harm to my life. But here Peter says something that is completely opposite of that. Do not be afraid of those who may kill you. That's, if I may paraphrase, that's essentially what he's saying. Do not fear the intimidation of those who are persecuting you, those who are making your life miserable. Do not fear them. We should not fear man. Another thing we should not fear, and this one is hard. This one is hard for all of us, and for good reason. But the text says we should not fear death. In Revelations 2:10, a passage that many of us can quote, if not in its entirety, at least a portion of it. Revelation 2:10, the part that we often don't quote is the very part that I want us to hear. In Revelation 2 and in verse 10, as John is writing the words of the Lord to the church at Smyrna, He says, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Don't be afraid of it. Do not be scared of it. Do not give in to those impulses to run away or to fight it or to hide from it. Do not fear it. Here's what you're about to suffer. Some of you are going to be cast into prison. Okay, that's bad, but maybe we can overcome our fear of that. But at the end, he says, be faithful until death. We do well to talk about until death, meaning up until the point that someone takes your life from you. Of course, that also means faithful until the day that we die. Both are applicable in this sense. But the point is, John starts by saying, do not fear, be faithful until death. Death might claim you, but John's instruction is, do not fear. Whether that's death at the hands of man or death at the hands of the very bodies that God gave us, at nature itself. John says, do not fear. There's no reason for those who walk obedient to the Lord to be fearful of death. And we see why right after that. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Why would I ever be scared of receiving the greatest reward there's ever been to be given? Why should I be scared of that? The reason I think that this is difficult for us to kind of swallow and internalize, I've met people, and you probably know of people, who are terrified to die, even though they are living, as far as you can tell, righteous lives. Death is terrifying, but yet we're told not to fear it. That's a struggle. We're not to fear our own death. We should not fear our own death. The last thing I want us to think about what we should not fear, this one might come as a bit of a surprise. But again, the text has much to say about it. It's something that we are not to fear, that we are not to run away from or try to fight or hide from, is the commandments of God. The commandments of God. You see, God has instructed us to do some things that, depending on our own life circumstances, might cause us fear. A good example, let's go back to the book of Deuteronomy. Both Moses and Joshua have quite a lot to say about fear. That's something that's stuck out to me in the past few times I've read through these books. There's a lot to be said about fear. And in Deuteronomy chapter 1, in verse 28, this is the complaint of the people. They say, "Where can we go up? Our brethren have made our hearts melt." That is poetic language to describe fear. Basically, they're saying, what are we going to do? We're terrified. The people are bigger and taller than we. The cities are large and fortified to heaven. And besides, we saw the sons of the Anakim there, the giants. Notice what is responded there. Then I said to them, "Do not be shocked. Do not fear them. The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight on your behalf." In other words, to paraphrase again, the children of Israel are saying, we are scared to death. How do you expect us to possibly do this? And the response they're given is, don't be afraid. Your God, the God who has brought you out of the land of Egypt, he is the one who is really going to do the fighting. You do not need to be afraid of doing what he has commanded you. In Joshua chapter 10, we see, again, much the same instruction. In Joshua 10, in verse 25, this is kind of some phrasing that is common throughout Joshua. Joshua then said to them in verse 25, "Do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight." Do not fear, be dismayed. The people were ordered to drive the Canaanite out of the land. And if our understanding is correct, they're fighting battle after battle. And Israel, for all its size, they were not warriors. These people in the land of Egypt have been slaves. These were not trained soldiers. Of course they're going to be fearful. But Joshua's commandment, Moses' commandment is, do not be afraid. God has commanded you to do this, therefore don't be afraid. For the sake of time, we'll skip Ezra 4 and Acts 18. In Ezra 4, we see actually the exact opposite. In Ezra, they were commanded to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and they were afraid, and so they stopped working. They stopped doing as they were commanded to do because of their fear. I want us to go to Matthew chapter 25. And we'll take a moment to read through this. Matthew chapter 25. As you're turning there, if your remembrance of Matthew is good, you might remember this is verses 14 through 30 at least, are the parable of the talents. The parable of the talents. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but get kind of the idea here. The parable that is given is that a man is going on a journey, and he entrusts his servants with some talents. These are lumps of currency. Most likely would have been gold or silver. And the first two did well with theirs. They used their talents to get more for their master. The final servant, though, and when the master comes back, these are rewarded. The final servant, though, in verse 24, it says, and the one also who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid. And I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, what you have is yours. But his master answered and said to him, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed, and you ought to have put the money in the bank, and on my arrival you would have received my money back with interest. Take away his talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. Skipping down to verse 30, throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. In this parable, while this is not necessarily the focus and the emphasis on the parable, the servant was afraid. He was afraid of fulfilling the task that had been charged to him. And so he did what he thought was safest. He let fear take over, and he did one of the 3 F's. He could fight, he could flee, or he could freeze. He chose the latter one. He froze. He did nothing. He was afraid of the task that had been given to him. And his master, when he returned, was most displeased. See, we should not fear doing that which God has expected us to do. That's easier said than done, of course. It's hard to not be afraid of, let's say, teaching your neighbor. That might be a scary thing to do. You might be fearful. The threat might be that you could lose a friend. The threat might be that you could be mocked or made fun of. The fear might be any one of those things. But we've been instructed not to be fearful of fulfilling the commands of God. When we talk about biblical fear, there's only one that we should fear, and that is God himself. There are many things we should not fear. Man, death, the commandments of God. We should not fear these things. And we're going to see that now as we look at 3 biblical examples of fear. 3 biblical examples of fear. These are stories that you know well. In fact, you could probably tell most of the story without ever even turning there. But I want us to consider these 3 individuals, it's actually 5, and consider what we can learn about their fear, what their fear might tell us as servants of God. The first one I want us to consider is Peter. When you think about Peter, you might not think about a man full of fear. After all, Peter is what we often describe as kind of the hot-headed disciple. Brash, a little brazen. He's not one that we often think of as being fearful. And before we talk about the passages, for all three of these examples, the word fear is not used. I want to get that out of the way. The word fear is not used, but the evidence of fear is there. So consider that with me as we go along. In John chapter 18, verse 4, we see that at Jesus' arrest, at the arrest of Christ, Peter was fearless. At Christ's arrest. John chapter 18, beginning in verse 4, it says, "So Jesus, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, 'Whom do you seek?' And they answered him, 'Jesus the Nazarene.' And he said that I am he. Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. So when he said to them, 'I am he,' they drew back and fell to the ground. Therefore again he asked them, 'Whom do you seek?' They said, 'Jesus the Nazarene.' Jesus said, 'I told you that I am he, so if you seek me, let these go their way, to fulfill the word which he spoke, of those whom you have given me, I lost not one.'" Simon Peter, here's our man. Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. And we see from there that Jesus instructs Peter to put the sword away. It's clear that Peter has no comprehension of what is actually taking place. But what I want to see is Peter's lack of fear. Earlier in the text, it says that Judas and the priests and the scribes came with the Roman cohort. We lose the word cohort. We're like, okay, cool, some Romans came. I got it. But the Roman cohort is a battalion of 600 armed soldiers. Here's Peter, a fisherman, with 11 other men, including the Lord, or 12 other men, including the Lord. And a couple of them have swords, including Peter. And here are 600 plus armed individuals trained for earthly warfare, and Peter is so fearless that he draws his sword and is prepared to fight. What bravery, what fearlessness we see in Peter. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Peter was fearless, but he was fearless of the wrong things. He was fearless of the wrong things. He misunderstood the situation that was facing him. So he goes from being fearless to being a man full of fear. And again, the word fear is not mentioned. In Matthew chapter 26, we get Matthew's account here gives us a bit more detail that fits what we're trying to see here. Matthew 26, and beginning of verse 58, after Jesus is carried away, Peter follows. Now, he follows at a distance. Verse 58 says, Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And he entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now, this does take a bit of extrapolation here, but if he's following at a distance, that implies he has some degree of uncertainty, some degree of fear. Peter has now realized he doesn't understand what's going on. If he was fearless still, he would not be at a distance. And yet here we see him following at a distance. Verses 69 through 75, we're not going to take the time to read it, but you know it well. Peter is then approached and asked 3 different times, "You were with this man Jesus, weren't you?" And all 3 times Peter denies it. And the question is, why would he do that? The first and most obvious answer is because it was prophesied. The Lord himself said that this would happen. The second, less obvious answer, but is very heavily implied in the text, is Peter was terrified of one of those 3 things that we said we are not to be terrified of. Peter was terrified of his fellow man. He realized that he had a misunderstanding of what was actually happening, and now he was scared. He was scared of the men around him. And so he forsook the Lord. See, Peter's fear worked against him. Peter's fear worked against him. A second example I want us to consider And again, we're going to draw some application at the end. The second example I want us to consider is that of Joseph. Joseph is such an interesting character because of the series of events that befall him and because of his disposition, his attitude towards them. Joseph is one of those people that we should study and study regularly because of his lack of fear, of his confidence in God. So we're going to see the same pattern. Joseph in his circumstances was fearless. We're specifically going to look at the incident with Potiphar's wife. In Genesis chapter 39, again, you know it well. Genesis 39. Of course, we know Joseph has come into position of power at Potiphar's household. He is second only to Potiphar himself. Verse 5 says, "It came about that from that time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph, and thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned." Verse 6, "So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and it came about after these things that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph and said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?'" Now, just reading through that, you might be saying, I don't see anything about fear there. But what I just read, when we consider the actual circumstance that Joseph is in, is a man who knew what he was saying was deadly. Joseph was refusing his master's wife. She has every ability to ruin his life and to even maybe cause it to be taken from him. Under Egyptian law, what she is proposing would not have been a death sentence for her, but for him. He was a slave. She was an Egyptian by birth. This iniquity that she is proposing would have been his death sentence. And if he refused her, that also was a death sentence. Joseph is in a lose-lose situation. But Joseph's so fearless that he says, "Absolutely not. I will not do this thing." See, Joseph was fearless of the very things we said we're not to be afraid of. Joseph was fearless of man, and in this case, of death. By refusing Potiphar's wife, he was signing his own death certificate, but he refused her anyways. What a lack of fear. What bravery. But while Joseph was fearless, much like Peter, but in a better circumstance this time, Joseph was also full of fear. Let's pick right back up. I know that says verse 10, but with verse 9, right? He says, "There's no one greater in this house than I. He has withheld nothing from me except you. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. And it happened one day that they went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. Joseph was scared. He was fearful of God. How then can I do this great iniquity and sin against God? Joseph knew that denying her was a death sentence. But he knew that sinning against God was an even worse death sentence. What godly fear can we see in Joseph? The third example, and it's one that I've spoke of from up here before in invitations and other events. This is something, it's an event that it sticks with me so strongly. I can't necessarily think about a topic like this and not think of these three men. I want us to consider Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In Daniel chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three friends of Daniel who were also taken captive out of the land of Israel. They were given Babylonian names, and perhaps we do them a disservice by only remembering them by those Babylonian names. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are faced with a terrifying situation, a situation that fear is inevitable within the situation. But let's again see where they were fearless. And I put it in quotation marks because I say they're fearless, but I don't know that they actually were in this circumstance. We'll explain here in a moment. Daniel chapter 3, beginning in verse 14. Of course, you know the circumstance. Nebuchadnezzar has been made aware that these three men refused to bow down to the golden image that he has set up. In verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? If you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound," and he lists a series of instruments there, "to fall down and worship the image that I've made, very well. If you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. What God is there that can deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." They displayed, outwardly at least, a lack of fear towards Nebuchadnezzar. And I say outwardly, and maybe this would have been fair to also apply to Joseph as well, but what man in his right mind would not be at least a little afraid of standing before that fiery furnace where death would have been painful and not necessarily fast? What man in his right mind would not be afraid? But yet their response was that of fearlessness. He said, "You already know the answer. You don't need to ask us whether or not we're going to do this because you know what the answer is, King. You know what the answer is going to be." They were fearless. But by that very same token, they were full of fear. Read again verses 17 and 18. They say, "If it be so, if you are going to do this, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us." Verse 18 is what I want you to see. "Even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." If I might put it in different words, what they're saying is, we fear God so much that even if he forsakes us entirely, we fear him enough to not bow down to your images. Our fear of you and our fear of death is so little compared to our fear of God that even if our God does not spare us, you will not have our fear. I want you to think about that. These men were standing in front of the very fire that was meant to slay them, and they said, "It doesn't matter. If God spares us or if he doesn't, we're still not bowing down. There's no amount of fear that you can instill in us that will overcome our fear of God." When we talk about biblical fear, that's biblical fear. That is biblical fear. And so, for the remainder of our time, and I know time's running short here, so I'm going to try to make this quick. For the remainder of our time, I want us to consider, do we have that level of fear for our God? Do we really? It's one thing to say it. It's another thing to actually have it. So let's consider some things that we learn from the things that we have seen this morning. Again, we'll hit these quickly. Some of these we've already discussed, and some we might not have discussed explicitly, but we've kind of hinted around them. First of all, fear is essential to our lives. If you live your life fearless of anything, you are living a hollow, empty shell of what life should be. Our lives should be ones that have fear in them. God gave fear to us for a reason, to preserve our lives. Fear physically protects us. We've got that, right? I'm terrified of spiders. That's probably going to save me one day. I'm being serious. I can't stand spiders. If there's one all the way back by the nursery, I'm going this way. Terrified of spiders. That might save me. That's not the fear I'm really concerned with. Fear preserves our souls. True biblical fear preserves and saves our souls. We've also learned that fear can be learned and can be taught. Just like we teach our children, don't touch the hot stove. If you do, it's going to burn you. And then when they do, we explain, hey, you're burned. This is why it happened. They learn to fear that hot stove a little bit, don't they? Fear can be learned and taught. What that means is we are responsible for teaching ourselves the proper fear of God. Think about that. We are responsible for teaching ourselves to properly fear God. And I know that's the case because we're surrounded by a world around us that has taught themselves to not fear God. They have taught themselves that. And so we must be teaching ourselves the exact opposite. We must teach ourselves to fear God. Do you think Joseph or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just decided one day that they were going to fear God more than man, more than death? They had to work at it. They had to strive for it. They had to desire that deep fear and reverence for God. And if we must teach ourselves, how much more so must we teach our children? We live in a world where the very idea of fearing any unseen entity is the epitome of foolishness. I'll say that again. We live in a world where the idea of fearing something that we cannot see is the height and the peak of foolishness. How much more so must we teach our children to fear God? They're surrounded by a world who calls that very concept foolishness. If we can learn and we can teach fear, that means we are of some control over our fear. We have some method of controlling our fear. Evidence: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego controlled their fear of that fire. Joseph controlled his fear of Potiphar and Potiphar's wife enough to submit to their fear of God. If it can be learned, we have control over it. The funny thing is, the doctors, the psychologists, they'll agree with you on this. Say, yeah, you can control your fear. You can train your fear. You can exhibit some degree of mastery over it. But if fear can be controlled, and if fear can be learned, and if fear can be taught, the scariest thing of all, fear can be forgotten. Fear can be forgotten. That is terrifying. That in and of itself is cause for fear, that if I can learn to fear God, I can also forget how to fear God. I can forget, I can lose my fear of Him. An example, of course, we can lose our fear of earthly things. We've all seen people with a mastery of fear over death. They don't fear death. They have learned to control that fear, that so natural fear of the unknown. They can control it because they lost it in the first place. We can do the same thing with our fear of God. Think about Peter. Peter, this man who had been following Jesus, who very clearly had some fear of the Lord, for else why would he be following Jesus in the first place? When it got difficult, everything he knew or thought he knew about his obedience to God went out the window when he swore, "I do not know the man." He forgot. He lost his fear of God in that moment. And so the ultimate conclusion for us this morning, the one that I want us to walk away with, the one that was the most important for us to get, the whole point of this, is that our fear of God must be constantly trained. Now that sounds odd, doesn't it? That we have to train ourselves to fear God. But we do. I know we do because it's commanded that we fear God. If it's a command, that means it's possible to not do it. And if it's possible to not do it, that means I might have to learn how to do it. You see the flow of logic there? We must constantly train ourselves to fear God, or else there was no need in it being a command. If it was just built into us to where you just did it, it was innate, there's no need in the command. The very fact that the command exists implies that this is something we must work for. We must work to be fearful of our God. And these next 2 points are not original with me. In discussing this as I was preparing, I was discussing with Shannon Stewart, so I'm going to give him credit for these next 2 points. Fear is easy when you can see what it is you fear. I can see that spider, and I know I'm afraid of it. That's easy. I can't see God. And so therefore, it takes effort. It takes desire. It takes training to fear Him. Fear is also easy when the consequences of ignoring it, or not ignoring it, are immediate. I'm afraid of that spider, but if I try to ignore my fear and pick it up and it bites me, I've paid the consequences right then and there, immediate. The consequences for not fearing God are not immediate. They're not immediate. And because of these two thoughts, these two concepts, we must train ourselves day in and day out to have a fear of God. Last two things I want us to mention, 2 verses. Both of them you know well. Let's consider Ecclesiastes 12 and in verse 13. Just my very mentioning of it, you probably are reciting it in your head. The Ecclesiastes writer, I believe, is Solomon, says the conclusion, when all has been heard, when we've considered everything about what this life means and what it is to exist on this earth, the conclusion when all has been heard is this: fear God and keep His commandments. This applies to every person. Or your translation may say, this is man's all. 4. God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. Hold that in your mind as we read Hebrews chapter 10. I said earlier that there is a sense in which we should be terrified of our God. There's a sense in which we should be terrified of Him. We should be terrified of displeasing Him, of doing the very things, of not doing the very things which the Ecclesiastes writer said. In Hebrews 10 and in verse 31, after going through, let's back up to verse 26. It says, "For if we go on sinning willfully, not doing the commandments of our Lord, not fearing Him, after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment." Verse 31. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Now, should we just be shaking in our boots at all times towards God? In a sense, yes. But our fear of God should include so much more than just a fear of displeasing Him. Our fear of God should include humble service. It should include holding Him in highest regard over all around us. Again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said, even if our God who has created us has turned His back on us, even if that were the case, still going to serve Him. They said that's not the case, but even if it were, because He is our God, and because we fear Him, and because we hold Him in reverence, we will not do what you say, O King. And so my plea for us this morning, and this is directed at me as much as it is anyone, my plea for us is to train ourselves to hold God in fear, in reverence, in awe, in wonder. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is man's all. That's what we're here to do, is to fear God and keep His commandments, to live our lives in a way that is pleasing to Him, and to be called His, to be His people, to be His children, and to hopefully one day live with Him in eternity. This morning I want us to consider the fear that we have in this life. Is it worth putting that fear above the fear we should have for God? Is it worth telling ourselves, I can't fulfill this command, I don't think I can. What you're saying is, I think I'm scared of it. I can't do this. I don't know how God expects me to do this because I can't do it. Or do you fear God enough to say, it doesn't matter how I feel, what matters is my attitude and my devotion towards Him? This morning, I want us to consider those things. I want us to consider the fear that we have in our lives. Fear is not a bad thing. Fear is not some ugly thing to be detested. Godly fear should be prized above all else. This morning, maybe you've realized that you have not begun to walk in the fear of God. Now is your opportunity to make that right. The water is here behind me. There are men that stand ready to baptize you, to bring you into the fold of Christ. Or maybe you haven't been walking quite fearfully. Maybe you viewed the wrath of God as something not worth being scared of. I beg and I plead with you to reconsider this morning. If you have any need at this time, won't you come forward while we stand and sing?